Psychedelic rock wasn't just a sound, it was a revolution. Born from rebellion, spiritual awakenings, and mind-expanding activities, they redefined what music could be. But by the early 70s, the dream died. So who or what killed psychedelic rock? Today we'll be taking a look at the mystery behind the fall of psychedelic rock and the shocking forces that silenced the trippy revolution. Let's start with the first blow that the genre took, the untimely deaths of its brightest stars. Number 1. Death of key figures. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison. 3 names that defined the essence of psychedelic rock, and 3 tragic losses that left the genre in shambles. Hendrix, the guitar god whose experimental sound revolutionized music, overdosed in 1970 at just 27 years old. His passing ripped out the heart of the psychedelic movement. He was the symbol of boundless creativity, and with his death, the genre lost not only a musical genius, but a charismatic leader who could carry it forward. In the same year, Janis Joplin, the queen of bluesy rock and raw emotion, was found dead from a heroin overdose. She had become the voice of freedom and wild abandon, and without her, the counterculture lost a fierce and unapologetic champion. Then, just a year later, Jim Morrison, the dark poet, the chaotic soul, died in Paris at age 27. His death was shrouded in mystery, and as the front man of the Doors, Morrison embodied the spirit of rebellious youth and psychedelic exploration. But with his death, the remaining members of the Doors struggled to hold the band's identity together. These deaths didn't just leave empty spaces on stage. They created a void in the very soul of psychedelic rock. With no one left to steer the ship, the movement began to fall apart. The tragic fate of these icons didn't just signal the loss of talent. It was a wake-up call, a harbinger of the end of an era. Number 2. Backlash against drug culture. The death of its brightest stars wasn't the only thing that brought the psychedelic rock movement to its knees. The late 1960s saw the rapid rise of a moral panic. LSD, the very drug that birthed psychedelic music, was suddenly demonized. What had once been the symbol of free thought and expanded consciousness became the target of fear, hatred, and government crackdowns. The media ran wild with sensationalized stories about bad trips and dangerous psychedelic experiences. Worse, the specter of mental health crises, like the breakdown of Pink Floyd's Syd Barrett into schizophrenia, fueled the growing fear around the drug culture. LSD wasn't just seen as dangerous, it was becoming the face of a larger societal collapse. Then came the Manson family murders. Charles Manson and his followers, high on LSD, committed brutal killings, shocking the world and solidifying the fear that psychedelic drugs were somehow tied to violence and insanity. The government responded with swift action. LSD and other psychedelics were criminalized, and by the early 1970s, the drug culture that had been at the heart of psychedelic rock was now being forced into the shadows. Number 3. Commercialization and Oversaturation. By 1967, the psychedelic wave had reached its peak, but as the movement grew, so did the pressure to capitalize on it. What was once an underground revolution became a mainstream product. This commercialization diluted the very essence of psychedelic rock. It wasn't about expression anymore. It was about selling a look, a sound, a trend. The purity of the movement was lost in the noise, as advertisers hijacked the imagery of free love and the potential of psychedelics. The music itself became an afterthought. For the true believers, the purists, the very soul of psychedelic rock was being compromised. The genre had gone from a potent political and social movement to just another trend to be bought and sold. And with the dilution came alienation. As the mainstream adopted psychedelia, it no longer felt like the unique rebellious experience it once was. Rise of hard rock and heavy metal. As if being commodified wasn't enough, psychedelic rock soon had to face an even bigger threat: the rise of hard rock and heavy metal. The raw, intense energy of bands like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath started to overshadow the introspective, often hazy nature of psychedelic music. These bands took the power of the electric guitar to new extremes, replacing the dreamy soundscapes of psychedelia with loud, riff-heavy anthems that were impossible to ignore. Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love or Black Sabbath's Iron Man were making all the waves. Their aggressive, electrifying sounds captured the imagination of young listeners in a way that psychedelia simply couldn't anymore. Hard rock and heavy metal didn't just replace psychedelic rock in the charts, they replaced its ethos. Where psychedelic rock was about exploring inner space, hard rock was about conquering the outer world. It was bold, and it had the energy that psychedelia, now associated with an older generation, lacked. The audience's taste was shifting, and psychedelic rock couldn't keep up. It was clear now. The golden age of psychedelic rock was fading into memory, eclipsed by a new wave of rebellious, louder, and more aggressive sounds. Number 5. Fracturing of the hippie movement. In the late 1960s, the hippie movement had been the backbone of psychedelic rock. Peace, love, and unity were the ideals that fueled both the music and the culture. But by the time 1969 rolled around, that idealism began to fall apart, and the events of the Altamont Free Concert marked its tragic end. What was meant to be a peaceful gathering at Altamont Speedway in California turned into a violent disaster. The Rolling Stones concert ended in chaos, with one fan tragically killed in front of the stage. The image of a violent, anarchic concert shattered the utopian dream of the hippie movement, and by extension, psychedelic rock. As if that wasn't enough, the Manson family murders, committed by followers of Charles Manson under the influence of psychedelics, sent shockwaves through the community. What had once been a symbol of enlightenment and freedom now had a dark, horrifying association. Psychedelic rock had always been a soundtrack for the revolution, but the revolution was dying, suffocated by violence, war, and shattered ideals. The collapse of the hippie movement was the death of the spirit that had given birth to psychedelic music in the first place. Number 6. Shift to progressive and art rock. By the early 1970s, the remnants of psychedelic rock weren't just struggling against hard rock and mainstream commercialization. They were evolving into something new entirely. The birth of progressive rock and art rock marked a dramatic shift in the sound and culture of rock music. Bands like Pink Floyd and Yes started to take the elements of psychedelia and fuse them with complex, sophisticated arrangements. Progressive rock was ambitious and highly technical, demanding more attention from the listener than the freewheeling spontaneity of psychedelic jams. Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon, 1973, became the highlight of this evolution. While the album retained traces of psychedelic elements, it was far more polished, precise, and conceptually cohesive than anything from the heyday of psychedelic rock. But as the music became more refined, something else was lost. The wild, spontaneous spirit of psychedelia gave way to something more polished and clinical, and for many fans of the genre, that shift was a betrayal. Psychedelic rock was about freedom, but in the hands of progressive rock, it became about structure. What had once been a movement of revolution and rebellion had become intellectualized and, for some, even pretentious. Number 7. Punk's anti-establishment rebellion. The mid-70s marked the birth of a new musical revolution, punk rock. But punk was more of a reaction, an angry rejection of everything that came before it, including the grandiosity of progressive rock and the perceived pretension of psychedelic music. Where psychedelic rock had been about creating expansive soundscapes and exploring the boundaries of consciousness, punk was about stripping it all down back to the basics. Punk's DIY ethos rejected the long, meandering jams and elaborate concepts of psychedelia. To the punks, psychedelic rock had become a relic of the past, an overly intellectualized, overblown genre that no longer spoke to the new generation's anger, disillusionment, or frustration with the world. The emphasis on political and social revolution, which had been a major part of psychedelic rock's early days, was replaced by a more immediate sense of rebellion in punk. Number 8. Internal band conflicts and burnout. It wasn't just external forces like hard rock and punk that pushed psychedelic rock into oblivion. The genre's internal struggles played a major role in its demise. Many of the bands that once defined psychedelic rock were falling apart from within. The pressures of constant touring, the weight of creative exhaustion, and the rampant drug abuse that often went hand in hand with the culture took their toll. Bands that had been the very face of the psychedelic movement were now dealing with internal conflicts that fractured their unity and creativity. Take the 13th Floor Elevators, one of the pioneers of the genre. Their frontman, Rocky Erickson, struggled with mental health issues, exacerbated by heavy drug use. The band's disintegration in 1969 marked the end of a key psychedelic group, with Erickson eventually suffering from schizophrenia, which was both a result of his drug use and a further blow to the movement's stability. Then there were the Doors. After Jim Morrison's death in 1971, the remaining members were left without their magnetic frontman. The Doors tried to continue, but without Morrison's unique voice and unpredictable energy, they couldn't maintain the same appeal. The band's efforts to reinvent themselves felt hollow. The essence of the Doors had been tied so tightly to Morrison's persona that their post-Morrison years felt like a pale imitation of their former glory. For many other psychedelic acts, burnout from constant touring and the pressures of maintaining relevance in a rapidly changing music scene also led to disbandments. The highs of the 1960s were quickly followed by the lows of disillusionment and burnout. As the drugs took their toll, both mentally and physically, many bands simply couldn't keep up with the demands of the music industry or their own internal battles. The genre had collapsed not just from external pressures, but from within itself, eaten away by the very excesses that had once defined it. But there was still one major factor that led to psychedelic rock's final extinction, something far more commercial and mainstream. Number 9. Legal and industry pressures. The final nail in psychedelic rock's coffin came from the very industry that had once embraced it. Record labels, radio stations, and venues began turning their backs on the genre, pushing it into the margins in favor of more commercially viable music. The criminalization of drugs such as LSD played a huge role in the genre's downfall. As psychedelic rock's ethos was intertwined with drug culture, psychedelics became heavily stigmatized in the public eye. The media sensationalized stories of bad trips and mental health crises, particularly with figures like Syd Barrett, whose mental breakdown and eventual departure from Pink Floyd became a warning about the dangers of excessive drug use. Governments around the world began cracking down on drug use more aggressively, making it harder for artists to live out the lifestyle that had come to define the genre. Venues were raided, festivals were scrutinized, and radio stations, eager to avoid controversy, started to avoid playing acid rock. Record labels, once enthusiastic about signing psychedelic bands, now turned to safer, more commercially acceptable genres like pop, disco, and hard rock. In short, the very forces that had nurtured psychedelic rock were now actively trying to stifle it. The industry had moved on, and psychedelic rock was left to wither in a landscape that had become less tolerant of its chaotic, rebellious spirit. But while psychedelic rock may have faded into the background, its legacy is still alive today, influencing countless genres. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think was the biggest factor in psychedelic rock's decline? Was it the deaths of its icons, the backlash against drugs, or something else? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're passionate about music history, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss any of our videos.